Hi everyone, welcome to my very first whole grain sourdough bread recipe for my new channel. I'm really happy to be here and sharing this with you all. I'm not an expert in whole grain sourdough baking, but I'm really experimental and I love it, and I'm really dedicated to baking with whole grains. So I'm really keen to just share my adventures really with you on this channel. This loaf, I did put a fair bit of thought into what I was going to do for my first recipe video on this channel. I decided to go for a loaf that is quite simply made, and it's baked in a tin, and it's just a regular old 100% whole wheat sourdough loaf. It's a kind of an everyday loaf, and for those of you who know me, you know that that's kind of my style. But there is a bit of a backstory to this. When I went to the grains gathering in Trentham, Victoria last year, so in October 2019 I went to that, and I had such a wonderful time. Hi Marie, if you're watching. I was really inspired by one of the keynote speakers there, Steve Jones. Steve Jones is a geneticist and a wheat breeder from the United States. He heads up the Bread Lab at Washington State University. And he has been, him and his colleagues and students, I imagine, have been very instrumental in promoting the use of whole grains and whole wheat in commercial bakeries and bakers in the States. Steve and some of the other speakers talked about this idea of the approachable loaf. And while it's something that they're aiming towards commercial bakeries and bakers, to encourage them to consider making breads for their consumers that have a high proportion of whole grain flours in them. As a home baker, it's something that really appealed to me too. And I think it's really in line with my kind of everyday bread philosophy. For me, bread making, actually soap making, all the things that I'm interested in, for me they have to be approachable and accessible to everybody. I'm trying to do things that help people who haven't done it before or would like to get into making their own bread, give them some experience and give them some examples of how it can be done simply without it being overwhelming and using a really lengthy, complicated process that takes your whole day. Because some of us do have a lot of time, but not all of us do. And some of us just want to have a really good, tasty, super healthy, 100% or high whole grain bread without going to too much trouble to make it. So the criteria for an approachable loaf is that, number one, it has to be baked in a tin and sliced. Number two, it has to contain no more than 7 ingredients, and that's easy. With mine, it's just wheat, water, salt, and some seeds on the top, so it's very simple. It has to contain no non-food. I'm not exactly sure how they define non-food, but I'm pretty sure my recipe that I'm sharing doesn't have any non-food in it. It has to be at least 60% whole wheat. So mine's fine. Mine is made of 100% whole wheat. I use this lovely organic whole hard white wheat from Demeter Farm Mills in Gunnedah in New South Wales, and I just ground this up in my mock mill, which you're going to see straight before I mix the bread. So really fresh, 100% whole wheat. It has to be priced under $6 a loaf. So I'm not selling my bread, I'm not a bakery, but for me it costs probably around $2 a loaf to make. So that's fine, that's Australian dollars anyway. And 10% of every loaf sold from the bakeries is to be returned to the Bread Lab to support their further research. So I'm sorry, Bread Lab, you won't be getting 10 cents from my loaf, but I understand that it's an initiative aimed at commercial bakeries and bakers. So I think that's great. I love that you're supporting the community, but you're also asking the community to support you back to further the research in this area. So that's pretty much it for the intro. I'll get into the recipe now. It's a really simple one, but I hope it encourages you to just have a try. If you really want to have the health benefits and the flavour of 100% whole wheat sourdough loaf, This is a kind of method that you can get started with. It doesn't have to be intimidating. There's just a few tricks that you need to know with whole grains, and you do have to adjust your expectations a bit because a whole grain loaf is never going to look like a refined flour loaf. It's just a different thing. But if that's what you're wanting to do, it can be done and it doesn't have to be difficult. So here's my example, just starting off with a simple, everyday, approachable loaf. Hope you enjoy it. So I start off this recipe by just weighing out my wheat. You can use 500 grams of whole wheat and mill it yourself, or just use 500 grams of whole wheat flour. Make sure that it's not sifted and it's 100% whole wheat flour. This is my Mock Mill 200 that I use, and you can see that I've got a bit of a funny technique. I don't use the dial at all. I just pull it down until it starts that ticking sound, and then I put the wheat in, and that gets the finest grind possible. I do think that it makes a difference having really fine flour, but you know, there's debate about that. Some people prefer coarser flour for their whole wheat breads, but I like mine really fine. This is that nice Demeter whole wheat grain. I'm not exactly sure what variety it is. You often don't get told what the varieties are here in Australia, but things are changing, so that's good. So I just use this flour really fresh, straight out of the mill, which you can see, and it is a bit warm. It's not super hot, but because it's warm, I use cold water in my bread, and that just helps to counteract the warmth in the flour. Because especially in here in Brisbane, in our subtropical summers, if I use warm flour and tap water or room temperature water, it would be too warm and the dough just wouldn't come together and it would over ferment. So I use 450 grams of water for this, which is quite a lot. It's about 90% hydration. And to be honest with you, it's too much. I have used other flours from my Queensland grown Kyalla wheat, and it is super thirsty and it can take this much water. But this is the first time I'm using the Demeter wheat for a while, and I forgot that it doesn't quite take as much. But that's okay. This is an approachable loaf. It doesn't have to be a perfect loaf. It still came out really good. But yeah, maybe you guys try 400 grams of water instead of 450. I think that might be a safer bet. So you just mix up the flour and the water and leave it to rest, or autolyse, for 1 hour. And the autolyse, you can see there, it really changes the texture of the dough quite dramatically. I've made so many of these without that autolyse, and I tell you, it really makes a difference. After that hour has passed, add your salt. I use 8 grams, which is about 1 1/3 metric teaspoons, and then you add your starter. I just use my starter, old starter from the fridge. Honestly, I don't make a levain or do anything fancy. I just use about 120, 130 grams of starter straight from the fridge and mix that in. I don't know whether I'm lazy or I'm just really efficient with my time. There's debate about that too, but I just love the simplicity of not having to plan for my breads. I just love to be able to take that starter out of the fridge and mix up a loaf anytime. So I am just using my beautiful dough whisk that my dad made me here. Thanks, Gary. And just mix that together. It's a bit hard to do on the bench. Usually I sit on a chair and I put the bowl in between my knees and I use 2 hands on the dough whisk. But it comes together. You're just really wanting to incorporate the starter and the salt. I like to scrape down the sides of my bowl as well, just to make it a bit easier to clean up later if there's no dry dough on there. And I just started to give this dough a little stretch and fold straight away. It is so extensible and, like I said, probably overhydrated, but that's okay. We're not into perfection here. We're just trying to make a good loaf of bread. Yeah, it's a really soft, lovely dough. I can tell it's going to be pretty good. So I just cover that then, and next I feed up my starter. This is how I manage my starter. I use it straight from the fridge, even if it's been there for 4 or 5 days, and then I feed it up with about 70 grams each of flour and cold water in this case. I mix that up and then I just leave this jar for the starter to kind of reactivate and ferment during the day while my bread is bulk fermenting, and then it just goes back into the fridge for next time. I know it's a bit of an uncommon way to do it, but honestly, I'm quite happy with the breads that I make using this method. I'm sure they'd be better if I used fresh starter, but the convenience of this for me far outweighs any benefits of doing any other pre-planning. So anyway, many ways to do it. There's no right or wrong. So what you do next is really just bulk ferment the dough. My bulk ferment took about 5 hours, and through that period, just do a few stretch and folds. You can see how sloppy and extensible this dough is. It's really, doesn't have a lot of strength at this point, but the stretching and folding will give it more strength and will, stretch up the gluten and give it more structure. If you didn't do that, it would have a different texture and still be bread and still be okay. But yeah, do a few stretch and folds. I think I did about 4. Sometimes I do 3. Sometimes I do more. Depends on how busy I am, really. Even 1 is better than none. So just do what you can. I think this is number 3. You can see that the dough is starting to ferment. It's getting quite sort of soft. But every time you stretch and fold it, you bring back that strength into the dough. And here's another one. You can see that the dough is starting to ferment more. It's getting more slack and starting to get a little bit gassy. You really just want to watch the dough, not the clock, when you're bulk fermenting it. You're wanting to see like about a 50% rise. This one went a bit further than I probably would have liked it to have gone, but that's okay. I was doing other things and it was a fairly warm day too. But it's okay. I just do one final stretch and fold here, and you can see I'm handling it quite gently, and I use that as a way to get the dough out of the bowl as well. I learnt that trick from Trevor J. Wilson. He's a clever man. So I just give that dough a final rest for about 10 minutes, and then I just do the final shaping, and I've got my tin ready with a bit of non-sticks baking spray in it. I forgot to spray my bench with water, so the dough stuck a little bit. I never use flour. I'm too much of a neat freak, and it's just a pain in the neck and it's a bit messy, so I tend to just spray my bench with water. But basically just kind of fold your dough up, roll it into a log shape and get it in the tin. You don't have to be too precise about it, as long as it's got a bit of tension to it. The rolling method works really well, and just pop it in the tin. I'm adding some black sesame seeds here and also some white sesame seeds. I think they just make it look really nice and they add beautiful flavour to the crust, which is delicious, especially when it's toasted, and just cover that up. So my final proof for this dough was 90 minutes, but again, yours will differ. You might only leave yours 30 minutes or it might be longer. It just depends on the temperature and the ferment of your dough. So many factors. And there's my starter. It just goes back in the fridge once it's activated. So it's just back in the fridge for next time. Here's the dough ready to bake after that 90-minute proof. I do bake mine inside this roaster, but you don't have to. You can just pop it in the oven without a cover as well. The covered roaster just does help create a bit more steam around the loaf. So you get a bit of a thinner, more crispy crust, and nice even cooking, and a bit kind of slightly better oven spring as well with the steam. So I bake this loaf for 1 hour at 220 Celsius or 430 Fahrenheit, and it comes out really nice. I do like my breads to have quite a dark crust. I think you get so much flavour from the crust. Yep, and it's cooked. That's just my little knocking test that I do. A bit old-fashioned, but it works. And yeah, it's gorgeous, lovely golden caramelised crust. Honestly, I've made breads in the microwave with no crust, just for fun, and they have no flavour. There's so much flavour in the crust. Anyway, here's the bread the next day. I'm really, really happy with this loaf. Like I said, it's not a perfect loaf. It's an approachable loaf, and I definitely use too much water in it, but it's okay. I eat most of my bread fresh, kind of the same day or the next day for sandwiches, and then after that it's toasted anyway. You can see how it's leaving a little bit of gumminess on the knife, but it's a gorgeous loaf of whole wheat bread, and it's really simple to make, and it's just a nice, easy way to get the bread done. I have a bit of a taste test here. It's nice. It's got kind of a moderate sour, but a lovely sweet wheat flavour. Just good, just great. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the video. I look forward to doing many more interesting videos to come. I hopefully learn a few things along the way myself. I'm sure I will. I appreciate all of your support, especially all of you who've subscribed already before me even sharing any bread videos. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. See you in the next one. Bye.